Welcome to episode 438 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we have Lachlan Kerin back to co-host a Q&A with listener questions. First of all, thank you everybody for all of the great questions. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I try to produce enough Q&A episodes that I end up answering the vast majority of questions that get sent in, so please feel free to take this as an open invitation to send in questions at any time, and they will get answered sooner or later. It might be 1, 2, or 3 Q&A episodes down the line. Usually, I would say 2 at most, but pretty much all questions end up getting answered eventually. And we have a great mix of very interesting questions today, so let's get right into that after first thanking our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, who create carbohydrate and electrolyte products that are effective, practical, and tasty. They are effective because they contain just the things we know work, so glucose, fructose, caffeine in the caffeine gel specifically, and sodium, and in the right amounts, and they contain nothing else, nothing unnecessary that is just there without providing a benefit, but potentially providing a source of gastric discomfort. They are practical because they are based on increments of 30 grams of carbs and 500 milligrams of sodium. So if you want to take on 90 grams of carbs per hour, it's super simple. You can take 3 times 30 gram gels or 1 times the 90 gram gel. So similarly, getting the desired amount of sodium and caffeine is also super simple based on the amounts that they have in their products. And finally, they are tasty, not in a very flavorful way. It's in a neutral, mildly sweet way. And I think that for a lot of people, from what I've heard, for me personally, that is definitely the case. This has been far easier to consume in higher amounts, especially over multiple hours compared to more flavorful products. And since Precision Fuel and Hydration started producing their gels and energy products, I have definitely been able to increase my amount of carbohydrate consumption just because I don't get flavor fatigue after a couple of hours of consuming high amounts of carbs. They also produce great content on their blog and newsletter, which is genuinely helpful and very well researched. So check that out if you haven't already. And as a listener of the podcast, you get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Zonate. The Zonate indoor swim trainer allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. For a lot of athletes, the limitation to swim training is that it can be very time-consuming to swim when you consider everything that goes into a swim, with commuting to the pool, all of the faff that you may have to get through at the pool before actually getting into the water, and so on. And this means that for a lot of people, it might only be realistic to swim once or twice per week. But with the Zen8, you can complement that pool swimming with quick and efficient home-based workouts that challenge the swim-specific muscles. So you can increase that all-important frequency of training and give yourself a chance to keep improving your swimming even when your pool time is limited. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8intra.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the Q&A with my co-host for today, Lachlan Kerin. Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, Lachlan. How are you doing, mate?
Good, thanks, mate. Nice to be here again.
Yeah, it's great. We have a good list of questions to tackle, so let's just jump right in with question 1, which is from Alex, who asks about the training with focus on longevity and quality of life. So what Alex writes is, I would be very interested in learning more on how I can train with a focus on longevity and quality of life in mind, particularly thinking of the third age. I'm 43 at the moment, rather than solely prioritizing performance. I am currently dedicating roughly 10 hours per week to training, aiming to participate in 1 Ironman event annually, but seeking guidance on adjusting my approach to prioritize long-term health and well-being over personal bests and racing. Long question short, how should my training regimen differ when the goal is to optimize long-term health and overall feeling rather than athletic performance?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? And probably something that, I mean, honestly, I've probably battled with that a little bit myself in the last couple of years. But I think a really important part of that question, and it's probably the start point for me, is like just being really honest with yourself about that too. I think, and that's probably from experience and working with some athletes in a similar situation is, I think it's easy to say that sometimes, but then, when you go out for every session, then all of a sudden, you actually are quite performance orientated, or you're chasing a target or trying to reach a time or a power or a speed that potentially, you haven't done the training to achieve, but potentially you were doing in the past. So I think that first start point for me is committing to that idea of being comfortable with, instead of optimizing performance, prioritizing that kind of longer term well-being.
Yeah, with that in mind, one thing that I think can work quite well is because Alex writes that he's doing one Ironman event annually, but actually mixing things up, doing new challenges. So maybe one year it's an Ironman, the next year it's a swim run, then it's a Grand Fondo, those sorts of things. Because when you have challenges that you don't have a benchmark for, it becomes easier to not let that past performance shackle your thoughts around what you want your performance to be, even if you do want it to be more focused on longevity and quality of life rather than performance. But I think that's one thing that I have had chats with some athletes about, the benefits of sometimes not just being solely focused on triathlon or Ironman, but having different challenges that you work towards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even around that, the idea of one event annually, I don't mind that at all. But I think for me, then, if that's the case, just understanding that you don't need to be specific to that event for 12 months either. I had in my notes, just kind of delaying specificity a little bit. Obviously, especially if you have a little bit of a background in the sport, I think keeping some novel stimulus through the rest of the year is important. And if we're talking about kind of longer term overall well-being, I think importantly too for me is ensuring that there's some strength training in there as well. Especially if we're talking about moving, towards 50. Not that he's quite there yet, but I think that's an important part of it as well, is making time within that 10 hours to include things outside of swim, bike and run. And for me, strength training is definitely one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I have my notes for this question are very short. I have 4 bullet points and 2 of them you mentioned already. So maybe I'll just read my list and then you can comment on the other ones as well if you agree. But the first thing I wrote was a bigger focus on strength training, because I think that if you're super performance focused on Ironman, then yes, strength training can be important. It depends on the athlete. For some, it's very important. For some, it's not at all important. But when the focus is longevity and quality of life, then I think for everybody, it becomes much more important than for the average only focus on performance triathlete. So that's definitely one, and it's the first one that I wrote down. The second one was a bigger focus on social training, because I think this is also something that we know about longevity and quality of life, that just a community and social interactions are very important, and having training be part of that social network, that I think can be basically a double whammy in terms of getting your training done, but also having some great social interactions and benefiting in that way, and which maybe is not always the best thing if you're completely focused on a performance goal, because then you can get dragged into other people's sessions, which is not always a bad thing, but it's definitely something that needs to be more managed when you're completely focused on performance. But when you're focused on health and longevity, I think that's more focus on social training, or just going out and training with your mates. That's generally a good thing. The third thing that I wrote was an even bigger focus on fun and enjoyment. Obviously, 99% of people listening to this are doing the sport not as their profession, so it should be fun, it should be enjoyable. But I think that for the focus on sometimes there are periods when you're focusing on performance where you also need to do sessions when you don't necessarily feel like it, and you just have to get it done. That's normal, but maybe in your case, when you know that your focus is on health and longevity, then you can change things up. Maybe on a day when you don't feel like going out for a ride, you change that for a strength session or something that you feel like on that day would be more fun. You can be more flexible to make sure that the things are fun and enjoyable even more often than they would be otherwise. And then the final one that I wrote was less focus on volume and specificity. So coming back to what you said there, I agree with that, delaying specificity as well. So you definitely don't have to have the same if you want to perform your absolute best in an Ironman, let's say, there is also a certain volume that is needed, and to some extent, more is better. That's not strictly true, of course, but for focus on health and longevity, I think that you want to have a certain amount of aerobic training, a certain amount of strength training, but it can be a lot less, and it can be very much contextual to the rest of your life in a different way, I think.
Yeah, look, there's also ways to kind of incorporate both of those things, into one session when you're being a little less specific, whether that's a circuit, it could include, some running and some weights or something like that. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, even just going to the gym and mixing up some different machines is something I've played with, 10 minutes on the rower, 10 minutes elliptical, whatever it is. Like, understanding, I guess, that keeping some of that kind of aerobic stimulus is still important, but mixing it up too. And I think the points you touched on there around fun, I mean, for me, that probably does stretch across, athletes from professional to recreational to just focusing on well-being, but obviously scaled at each of those levels. So yeah, I think that social interaction is always important, but especially, if you're in a space where your training time is really your only spare time, and that's not leaving you a lot of social time, then definitely those two things can be integrated, especially when well-being is the priority.
Yeah. Did you have any other points or anything else that you thought of that we should mention?
For me, just one would be, also being a little bit unafraid to go out for whether it's a bike or a run or swim and just, go off a stopwatch. You don't necessarily need to be super connected to the data. I think just going out and enjoying it for what it is also important when your goal is optimizing long-term health.
Yeah, 100%. It does flow into some of the other things we already mentioned, but doing things like exploring new roads that you haven't been riding on, doing challenges in training, which could be like doing an oversized bike ride or something every once in a while, if that's something that motivates you, those sorts of things as well. So not something that you would find in a regular training plan necessarily, but something that will help you be motivated and enjoy what you're doing, I think.
Yeah.
So I think we can move on to question number 2 for today, which is from Melissa, who asks about power difference on hills versus flats. So Melissa writes, "Hi, Scientific Triathlon. Thanks for the amazing job that you do at making triathlon an inclusive sport, yet keeping a healthy rigorosity. My question is related to the power on hills versus the power on flats when cycling. I am able to put out and sustain higher power on hills, but it is incredibly challenging to do the same on flats. Do you think it has to do with the position of the hips, the angle of the ankles, inertia? I would love to sustain the same power on flats."
Yeah. Okay. So for me, I think there's probably a few things to pick apart in this question. So one is just understanding, the output up a hill versus on the flats. So obviously up a hill, if you have a steady gradient or relatively steady, then the power output is also, it's much more manageable to keep it in a certain range. Whereas on the flats, it might be quote unquote flat, but inevitably you have some short downhills or little rollers, or you have to take a corner or head or tailwind. So, or a car goes past. So any time that you're at, say, 0 watts or well under target power, to kind of get your average back up is quite a challenge, right? So, if you spend 5 seconds at 0 watts and you want to average 200, then, if you wanted to make that up in 5 seconds, you'd have to do 400 watts for 5 seconds, right? So I guess that's just one element of the environment that can make it tougher if it's not something that you're used to doing, and also depending on where you're doing it. So, I guess that also plays into a point I had around safety. So, it can actually be just a safety issue if there's cars and things like that, or you have to dodge traffic or, road furniture, anything like that. So I think just keeping that in the back of mind is important, and probably, I'm sure you do the same, but for a lot of my athletes, I'm always giving a range of power, and if I know they're going to be doing that on a flat road, or, a slightly rolling road, I will often say, like, just make sure that the power is kind of in that range for the most part, but don't get too caught up on the average power, because there's a lot of variables that could cause it to drop. And, we can be kind of changing the stimulus if you're going way out of the zone just to bring the average up. So that's probably one point for me without touching on the other stuff just yet. Do you kind of agree on that front?
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. That's very well said.
And then for me, I think position's probably a big part of it. Obviously, not a lot of context on if this is on a road bike or TT. I guess on a TT bike, definitely I'd suspect that the position would be quite different climbing to on the TT bars, for instance. A lot of people will climb with their hands on the pads, which is going to have a much more open hip angle, most likely, than being on the TT bars. Also, just where you sit on the saddle, likely to sit a bit further back and engage some different muscles, and potentially, if we're talking like anterior and posterior hip rotation, potentially the saddle height is effectively a little bit different. So definitely, there's some changes in position, as well. I guess the inertia factor is part of it. The application, I guess, of torque might be slightly different with those changes in position, and also, doing the power output at potentially a different cadence. So I'm kind of unsure with this question if the athlete would potentially be at a different cadence, but again, that comes down to that ability to kind of hit a really narrow range is a lot tougher on a flat road, where you can't just necessarily peg it in one gear, because the cadence will be a lot more variable than it would be uphill.
Yeah, I think Melissa answers her own question a bit, because all of those things that she talks about with the position of the hips, the inertia, etc., they all probably have an impact in making it harder to sustain the power output. But also, as you say, the variations get magnified on a flat road with higher speeds compared to uphill. It is so much harder to maintain power in that narrow range. So that's definitely one thing to also consider. But I guess what I would add is whether it matters or not, because I think there are quite a few studies comparing uphill power output versus flat, and even in professional athletes. I'll put a link in the show notes to one study from Valenzuela that was in World Tour and Pro Tour cyclists, and even in that cohort of very, very good cyclists, there is a difference, and that power output is higher uphill compared to on flat roads. So it's normal. It's not. I don't think that the goal necessarily is to achieve the same power output on the flat, but it is one aspect of it is, as you say, if you have a session that you're doing on the flat road, I think the execution of the session, as you say, trying to keep the majority of it within that target range is a good way to think about it. If you're in a race, then of course what you're more concerned with is to ride as fast as possible. So it's not about achieving the highest power, because in theory, you could sit up really, really upright on let's say on your road bike, for example, to on the flat even achieve a higher power output than if you go down into an aero road position, but your speed will be a lot slower, and that's not what you're interested in. You're interested in going as fast as possible. So I think it comes down to achieving the best possible power output for the optimal riding on a given terrain, so meaning on flats, you want to ride fast and still produce, but produce as much power as possible in a fast position. On uphills, you obviously, because of the slower speeds, you can basically optimize your position for how can you produce as much power as possible. So that gives you that opportunity to produce more power. But it means that, comparing uphill to flat riding, you should probably not be hung up on achieving the same power output, but more so on, are you executing the session correctly, or are you riding as fast as possible in a race? So I would just say specificity becomes a key question here. Are you training for a flat race? Then try to do a lot of training on flat roads and achieve the right power output for your training in the position you'll be racing. And similarly, if you're training for a very, very hilly race with lots of climbs, try to simulate that in training. And the power outputs might be slightly different, but you will be basically preparing yourself optimally for the race that you are going to do later on. So do you think, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we look at a race, the results don't post your power numbers, right? It's who gets from the start line to the finish line the fastest. And so if it is a flat race, I think kind of optimizing around that is important. If it's a really hilly race, then, optimizing around that and being specific to that into a race is also important. So yeah, I'm with you on all fronts there. And look, there can be kind of an interplay between both of those things too. Like an example might be a rolling course where actually you do need to also learn how to kind of get towards the top of the hill and get back into TT position or into that faster position without having the kind of high speed yet, but working yourself back up to speed before you get to the downhill. So yeah, I think being really aware of what the race is going to bring, and then, working within the bounds of what you have available to you is probably important. And look, that can be challenging if you have a flat race and all you have around you is hilly terrain. Then potentially you do need to be a little bit adaptable or potentially willing to even be inside for some of those rides to just get extended time in that position.
Yeah. Anything else on this question, or shall we move on to question 3?
Move on, yeah.
Yeah. So the next one is from Callum, who writes, I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thank you for all your hard work with it. My partner recently raced Aix-en-Provence 7.3 in under 4 hours 50, using a plan heavily based on your 7.3 advanced plan, which is fantastic. My partner is a pretty serious age group triathlete. She trains around 13 to 16 hours per week. We have a portable lactate meter and test on the bike and run relatively regularly. She has a high LT1 relative to LT2, about 85%, LT1 being 85% of LT2, that is. And she is a classic slow twitch / diesel type athlete. She basically has one gear, whether it's a 10 kilometer or a marathon. She recently ran sub 3 hours at Barcelona. Her LT2 / CP, so critical power, is pretty stubborn, and she has worked hard over the last months to increase it. It has improved relatively successfully, but if she neglects it for just a couple of weeks, it reduces very quickly. VO2 max may also be a slight limiter in increasing CP / LT2, but based on her power profile in training, I don't think it is a very significant limiter. I was hoping for your input on what you normally do with athletes with this kind of physiology. There's lots to unpack there.
Yeah. I read that then as potentially like VO2 or power at VO2 is relatively high, or speed, if we're talking about running, in comparison to that kind of LT2 critical power, critical speed. So for me, in terms of the relatively high LT1, I don't think that's incredibly surprising given the background of being, a serious age group athlete and consistently doing that 13 to 16 hours per week, I guess, over a long period of time. You definitely expect that to add up. In terms of, this kind of notion of one gear, whether it's a 10K or marathon. So if we talk about running, I guess my note around that was just understanding that there's probably a little bit of a biomechanical aspect to that as well. So I know we will touch on this later, but in terms of running faster, how are you going to do that? Either cadence or stride length, right? But if you're limited in the sense that you actually can't really increase your cadence that much more, but because it becomes incredibly inefficient, then you kind of need to increase stride length, if that makes sense. So if we're talking at least about the running aspect of this question, there could be some kind of limitations in terms of just that ability to actually increase stride length, whether it's not enough hip mobility, for instance. So that could be one part of it. And then also, I think it's kind of mentioned here around, spending time, at that pace or around that pace in order to maintain it, and not let the LT2 drop. Again, I guess it comes back to this idea, at least in running, of kind of spending time at those paces in order to kind of optimize economy as well.
Yeah. I have a question for you here, because on the one hand, when I read about what is it? So he writes that Alex has basically one gear, whether it's a 10 kilometer or a marathon. Okay, that's pretty normal. That's something that I've seen a lot, worked with a lot of athletes like that. But then the things that he's writing about critical power or LT2 being a limiter, but VO2 max not being a limiter. So is that something, have you seen a lot of profiles like that? So basically you would then assume that she could run or ride pretty well for, let's say, 2 to 10 minutes. Let's say a 5-minute power test on the bike. Put simply, she would have a pretty decent 5-minute power. But then despite that decent 5-minute power, there's a very small difference between marathon pace and 10K pace, or if we put it in cycling terms, let's say Ironman power and Olympic distance power.
Yeah, so for me, that probably isn't what I would define as a typical quote unquote diesel engine. I would maybe think, and if we're talking about that power being indicated by like just a power test and not actually, in the lab. So we don't actually necessarily know her VO2 max, although I guess we could estimate it with some calculations, but we don't know. And for me, that might indicate that actually, she's a little bit more glycolytic. What do you think?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, if those assumptions are correct, that's what I would also understand it as. But my gut feeling here, when I, again, coming back to that comment about she basically has one gear, whether it's a 10K or a marathon, I think that's a pretty common, that's a diesel engine. And I think that maybe the assumptions about VO2 max not being a limiter might be incorrect. And I would like to see like the power duration curve, speed duration curve, of course. But maybe the way that I read this question and then answered it was more based on, I actually read it as, I think that she maybe is just a pure diesel engine, but also VO2 max could be the limiter here just as well as LT2. So basically not being oversized in terms of VO2 max compared to LT2.
So let's just discuss both then. For me, I guess if we assume the VO2 max is relatively high compared to the second threshold, I then would be thinking that some more extensive work in the heavy domain is probably where I would lean to. And it sounds like that is probably what she has to do consistently in order to maintain, LT2 around where it is. Because for me, what it sounds like is that if she doesn't necessarily work in that kind of more extensive heavy domain, and the LT2 drops potentially, that's just that, again, it's just becoming a little bit more anaerobic and producing a little bit more lactate. So maybe that is why it's kind of dropping in terms of the curve. What do you think around that approach, if that is the case?
Yeah. If that is the case, then I would tend to agree. I have to say that I don't really think that that's the case, because that she would potentially drop quite quickly in power output or speed output from, let's say, 5 minutes to 30 minutes. So from like VO2 max to critical power, but then have the same power output from LT2 to LT1 or same speed output. It's just something that I haven't seen, and that this is what I struggle with this question. So, but I do agree with that if that is the case. But at the same time, I struggle to give that answer because I see it as quite unlikely, to be honest. And I would be really curious. Maybe Callum can email me back after this, and we can get some more information about her power curve and speed duration curve. And we could maybe even follow up in a later episode. But I've written down some things based on my assumption that because she has a similar speed from marathon to 10K, that she is very much a diesel engine. And I just think that, she just probably has to do more work at higher intensities for one thing to help overcome that limiter. But then how you do that when you are a diesel engine, that is something that you kind of need to be a bit, maybe, or potentially you need to be a bit specific about, because it can be really hard to do things like 3-4 minute intervals if you have a very low W prime or D prime. So I think like intervals like 30-15s, 40-20s, 60-30s, up to that range, that can be a really good way of, they're short enough that you can produce a high power or high speed, and you can recover quite quickly because you're strong aerobically, but you don't really, and then you can refill your W prime, or what is it, reconstitute your W prime during that recovery. So I like those kinds of intervals for this profile of athlete. But the other thing is, with the biomechanics that you say, I completely agree with that. That could be an issue on the running side of things, potentially also strength training. And I think that especially for, this is a female athlete we're talking about, I believe. Yeah, it is. So strength training can be more of a limiter potentially as well. And maybe going and doing some strength training, also plyometric training, could unlock some capacity, actually, both on the run and the bike. On the bike, it would be more heavy strength training, improving the max strength, maybe even muscle mass. On the run, it could be a mix of, well, that would certainly help, but also plyometric training to improve economy. So those are a couple of things that I would say. But then the third thing is that my experience with this profile of athlete is that sometimes the psychological profile goes hand in hand a bit with the physiological profile. That this might be the type of athlete that is really committed, really motivated to train, wants to train at a high volume, and but maybe is not getting the relative rest that they need to adapt to the harder workouts that they're doing. So maybe the sessions that they're doing are very good and would help her improve, but maybe she needs to think about if she's doing the easy sessions a bit too hard to really be able to push to move the needle in the harder sessions. Again, pure speculation, but I've seen examples of this in similar profiles of athletes, and also considering, maybe it doesn't necessarily mean lower volume overall, but maybe taking every once in a while an easier week, taking rest days, those sorts of things. I would look into what the rest looks like for this athlete, just based on my experience with similar profiles of athletes.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. Like, if we're talking a sub 3 hour marathon, we might be talking about 4:15 per K. But if LT1 is relatively high, an athlete like that, and I've seen this plenty of times before, conceivably can go out and do a hell of a lot of running at, 4:30 per K. So it's only, maybe 15 or 20 seconds slower than marathon pace, which, again, potentially I do see a place for that sometimes, depending on the athlete. But if it's hindering recovery, there can be that element as well, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, clear this is a very strong athlete with sub 4:50 for the 7:3, sub 3 hours for the marathon. So it's not that clearly what they have been doing is to some extent really good. It's been working, but sometimes you just have to, when you do one thing for a long time, then at some point you might need to change things up, even turn it on its head a little bit to then take the next step, because at some point you end up stagnating on doing a similar thing. So it might be, that would be some, just gut feeling on my part, that maybe just polarizing things a lot more than currently. That might be that kind of flipping things around a bit to get a very new stimulus for the body to adapt to and take the next step, basically.
Great. I like that idea of kind of having some novel stimulus, like at least at some point. If there's a 70.3 in 3 weeks, maybe not the time. But I think just come back a little bit as well to your point around the psychology of athletes like this. I totally agree and understand and have experienced it myself, is that it can be really hard if, you're quite successful at, say, a marathon 70.3 Ironman, to then go and actually race a 10K hard, is really challenging. Like, you might be slightly above that LT2 critical speed, whatever, for the race, or there might be, 1 or 2 Ks in there where you have to run faster than that. And if you have a really small D prime, then, that can be quite costly, right? So, Yeah, and often, like as you said, I'm sure you and I have both seen the complete opposite of this profile quite a lot. You know, someone can run a really good 10K, but their marathon is just nowhere near on the same level. So, yeah, I think the psychology plays into it a little bit as well, around kind of the athlete that you associate yourself with being, and then, you know, migrating to just doing that kind of training a lot as well.
Yeah, totally. But on the good side of that is that I do think that a lot of times these types of athletes are super motivated. So even though it's not doing something like a 5K or park run, is maybe not something that they feel that they're good at, and relatively speaking, their marathon might be a lot stronger. That kind of challenge can be quite motivating and something that they can get fired up about and help to motivate them to do also that training that they're maybe less proficient at with the higher intensities and so on. So there's always that question about whether to train your strengths and your weaknesses. And to some extent, I think that it doesn't all generally work so well to just try to hammer your weaknesses and hope that they become strengths. But I think you need to be a bit careful with that when, for example, if you have a diesel profile, yes, high intensity can help to overcome a weakness to some extent, but how much of that you do, I think you need to be quite careful with that, because the tendency might be to want to do just a lot of it and as quickly as possible become strong and become better, take the next step. So I think that's something to consider as well, that when I'm talking about, for example, adding high intensity, it doesn't mean that now suddenly every single hard session that you're doing needs to be high intensity or that you need to do a lot of them. But yeah, just introducing that and building that gradually in a way that is sustainable for the athlete in question, I think is something to consider.
Yeah, it might even be, I know you and I have talked, you know, at length and many times about something like a block periodization. You know, it might just be some blocks of that within their kind of macro cycle. But yeah, I kind of agree on all those fronts. I guess one more thing I'd touch on, if the goal or one of the end goals is ultimately performance, and that, you know, let's just say in that context, you know, performance might be measured in where you place in your age group, for instance, then for an athlete like this, you know, potentially too, just considering race choice is probably, you know, part of that too. Like if that's your profile and that's where you're very strong, then maybe doing a longer race might actually suit your strengths too. Or, you know, a 70.3 that is, you know, going to take 30 minutes longer because of the course profile, that might actually be a good choice. So just thinking about those things too.
Yeah, 100%. I think that we covered that question. So let's move on to the next one, which is from John. This is a two-part question. So let's take part A first. So John asked about the evolution of stroke/stride length versus cadence. You often hear advice about this trade-off. In the early stages, a triathlete is often urged to up the cadence and thus avoid gliding in the water or plodding on the run. This may be good advice in the short term, but to evolve and become faster, an athlete must become stronger and more technically proficient and improve directly or indirectly the stroke/stride length in all sports. Can you discuss this aspect in the evolution of a triathlete's career?
Yeah, I think we just touched on that a little bit. You know, if we go across each of the three sports, you know, beginning with swimming, I guess this idea of avoiding a glide amongst age group swimmers for me is less so about avoiding a glide, and it's more so about avoiding a position where the elbow drops below the wrist, and then, you know, effectively your only move for the forearm is to push down towards the bottom of the pool. You know, a lot of athletes will try and kind of do what they kind of describe it as a glide, and then end up in that position where they're not able to actually set up an effective catch. So that's probably one part of that. And I think that's probably, you know, a little bit to do with, you know, just time swimming. So if you didn't kind of swim as a kid, you're not going to have that proprioception of the water. Thoracic mobility probably plays into that a fair bit, and just mobility, even through hips or thoracic rotation, all of those kind of things. But then also understanding that, I guess, when you get into the open water, sometimes being able to maintain a higher cadence and good turnover can be really beneficial if it's choppy, or if you're, on feet where you're essentially trying to catch bubbly water. I think being able to have, a good stroke rate is important. And like, even just spending a lot of time with swimmers now, in kind of my work in that sport, like seeing the difference between the 10K open water swimmers and the 100, 200 swimmers, like there's definitely a big difference in stroke rate. But I think there's also a misconception of what the glide is amongst, especially age group athletes, in that it's more of an extension than a glide, if that makes sense, right? Like, it's about getting a longer stroke length, but it's not about just gliding through the water. It's not necessarily about having a pause out in front of your stroke.
So what is your take on if you have a new triathlete or somebody pretty new to triathlon, they're let's say a 2 minute per 100 swimmer, which is quite normal when people start. Do you advise them on how high their stroke rate should be, like, or is there a limit where you say that, okay, your stroke rate is probably way too low, we need to increase it a little bit, or what is your approach to that?
In my honest experience, like, every athlete I see like that, stroke rate is pretty low, and often the athlete might not even feel like it's that low, because they might actually be, pushing force through the whole stroke. It's just in the wrong direction. So I often see, athletes with a stroke rate of, like, if we're, say, using either stroke, like 50 strokes a minute. And for me, we might work towards 60, 65, even 70. Like, I've seen, if you start looking at the top end of say a pro race, then you often see stroke rates in the 70 to even 80 range. So that's definitely something I work on, but at the same time, it's about making sure that you're not doing that at the expense of everything else, right? So I do think you first need to set up and develop what an effective catch feels like, and I think that's probably a priority first for me. And then, developing some speed through stroke rate. But also, like, I think part of that process too is then having a range of stroke rate that you can actually tap into. So you're not just stuck at the same rate all the time. And then, you can kind of adjust pace with rate, as opposed to trying to, differentiate the stroke length all the time.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, I think I'm quite similar in that. Once you get into like the low 60s, then I'm quite happy for stroke rate to be whatever it is, while working on if there are things within the stroke technique to improve on and focus on that, and not so much push a slower swimmer to swim at a stroke rate of 70. But if you're a slower swimmer and your stroke is 50, then I think that that tends to be quite a bit too slow. So there is, I guess there is that point, and everybody might be a bit different where they think that it is, but where the stroke is just too slow and we need to get it up a little bit. But then once it's up to a certain level, then you can focus on getting a good catch, a good overall technique, and then again, when that is more in place and more ingrained, then you can start to focus again on stroke rate a little bit. So I guess you kind of alternate what you focus on based on where you are and where you start. So I guess that coming to the question itself, I think it makes sense that you often hear advice early in the career of triathletes, because as like you said, I agree that most people that you see that are kind of beginner swimmers, they end up with a stroke rate that's just way too low. So it does make sense in that sense, but it's not necessarily about stroke rate must be improved before stroke length. It's about where are you at, and what is the context. I think that Swim Smooth used to have, I'm sure you can still Google it and find it, a pretty good chart where based on your swimming speed, roughly what range should your stroke rate fall in. And of course, these are generalizations, but I always found that chart to be pretty good. You can see that if you're a 2-minute swimmer, 2 minutes per 100 swimmer, you should be in this range, or 130, you should be in that range, and so on. So that was a pretty good chart, and maybe I'll see if I can find that and put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, I think that's helpful too, because like, as you said, if you're at 2 minutes 100 and your stroke rate 70, then evidently, stroke length should probably be a priority, right? But if you're at 45, then probably I'd be thinking about how do we improve the rate. And also like things around that, right? Like the timing of the breath becomes different as you increase the rate and all of these things. So, it's kind of hand in hand a little bit as well.
Yeah. I think that, so then the other question, and we can stick to swimming because a lot of this will kind of be the same for the other sports, but sticking with the example of swimming, you have this triathlete. They have now been in the sport for 5 years. They are a pretty decent swimmer. Maybe they're swimming, maybe they are around 130 for their critical speed or their threshold. So that's pretty decent for an age group triathlete. Actually, it's good for an age group triathlete. And so and maybe their stroke rate is, I don't know, maybe it's high 60s or so. Where do you, or at what point, if their stroke now looks like, okay, there are no kind of obvious flaws in it, and this is quite common at this pace, that there are no like super obvious mistakes that they're making. Obviously, there are a lot of things that could be improved when you're swimming 130 and not 1 minute compared to, or faster. But still, it looks decent. What do you do then? How do you get faster? Is it just about getting fitter? Do you focus on, at some points, on stroke rate? Do you focus on stroke length? Where do you take it from there?
Yeah, I think there's, you can never discount the fitness aspect of it, right? And I've seen that profile as well, where the athlete is very strong on the bike and run. So there's kind of an idea that at least centrally the fitness is quite high. But then you also have to remember, like, we're using the upper body instead of the lower body. So if you're only swimming 3 times a week, for instance, like, it's just not that much time that you're spending every week, using those muscle groups and developing that same kind of capacity and fatigue resistance and things like that. So there's probably, yes, an element there of just getting stronger and fitter. And I use that term stronger, like, very much in the context of say triathlon training, not strength training. But I think inevitably at those paces, there still are flaws in the stroke, I think there's probably still a lot that can be worked on. It just becomes a little bit more intricate. And I think when I'm looking at an athlete that's, say, in that 2 minutes per 100 range, often for me, there's one thing that's causing a chain reaction. So it's often like an over rotation for the breath, or the timing of the breath is so off that it's throwing everything else out. It's causing a scissor kick, and it's causing, a dropping of the front arm. So you try and fix that main thing first, and then kind of see where the chips fall a little bit. Whereas once you start getting to that pace, I think you can then start looking a little bit more intricately at different parts of the stroke. Like, if the timing of the breath is good, there's not necessarily an over rotation. We might then start thinking about, little parts of the stroke. Are we kind of pushing out towards the sidewall just a little bit? Can we kind of, develop that one arm a little bit more than the other arm? So there's probably some more intricate details in the stroke that can be kind of analyzed as well.
Yeah. And then obviously when you, I think, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say too, like, and the next point on that is too, for me, in terms of triathlon, we're pretty much always swimming in the open water. So there's a lot of open water skill as well that I think can, if it's an opportunity to develop that, can become really important. Yeah.
I think I guess on swimming in general, like any thinking about stroke length, whenever you whenever you improve your technique in some way, you're improving stroke length. But it's not about focusing on a long stroke necessarily. When when you get the time of your breath better because you're causing less drag, and maybe the timing of your stroke gets better, you're automatically swimming, your stroke length improves. And the same obviously goes for running as well. When you have your standard cadence that you're running at, and when you get fitter over time, then that's because your stroke length gets higher. So I think that with stroke rate, there are definitely times when you need to focus on that a bit more, but with stroke or stride length, then that comes as a consequence of other things that you're doing rather than being something that you focus on directly. And John does mention that in the question, that directly or indirectly. And I think with stroke length, it is very much indirectly in most cases. In swimming, very much of that is just reducing drag as much as possible, and then other technical changes to make the stroke more efficient. But drag really has a huge impact on it, because if your drag is 10% higher, then the power needed to have the same stroke length is just so much bigger, because water is such a dense medium. I think just one thing to add to running and stroke length, because we've been talking a lot about swimming, is that I think in running, some of the things we already mentioned in the previous question can be beneficial when you things like strength training and plyometric training, because you're basically you're basically trying to optimize the free elastic recall that you're getting from the fascial tissue. So that can be something to consider, or a direct intervention that you can do to increase your stroke or stride length, without necessarily improving fitness. That's one particular example on the running side of things that we can use. But yeah, I think we talked a lot about this. Is there anything we've missed? I'm not sure if we have been super structured, but I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably obvious, but especially for swimming and running, and I think the question kind of mentions it anyway, but there's a ceiling in terms of cadence too, right? Like, you're not going to run a marathon probably at 200 RPM. Like, you can try, but it would be pretty challenging. You're just not spending much time on the ground if you're doing that. So I think being aware that if you're, even in running, like if you're already running, and it's a discussion I've had with an athlete recently where the cadence is so high that we can't expect you to really run much faster, because you just can't run at a higher cadence than that. So we actually need to improve stride length. And again, I think you've touched on the points around how we might do that. But yeah, it's a similar thing. I guess just to touch on the bike, for me, the bike is probably also very dependent, and we'll touch on that in the next question, but on the actual output as well.
Yeah. I think that that's my final point on this one, that you get to a point where stroke or stride rate is basically at your individual optimal, which is different for different people depending on their speed, their anatomy playing a huge part, whether you're very tall or very short or somewhere in between, and the limb length in swimming and running. But you get to that point, probably it depends on how much you're training. But if you're somebody who's training very consistently week in, week out, and I would say in 5 years of triathlon training, what do you think? Something like that. A lot of people could get to their optimal running cadence or their optimal swim stroke rate. But then beyond that, you probably still have 5 or 10 more years of, depending on how old you are, of continuing to improve your stroke or stride length by A, getting fitter, but B, some of the other things we discussed, like the technique swimming wise, potentially strength and plyometric training on running and mobility, those sorts of things. So that's kind of the sequence of events. And but the rate, stride rate, stroke rate, you come to it quicker, and then from there on it's more about stroke length. But yeah, it's about the things that you, not about focusing on that itself, but the things that can be helpful to improve it. All right. So part B of John's question is, you often hear advice like use a low cadence on the bike because you need the cardiovascular system for the run, or you need the hamstrings on the run, so don't use the hamstrings to scrape the pedals on the bike, stomp instead. Can you discuss the value of considering these aspects for planning one's own approach to training, development, and racing?
I think I'll just start by saying I don't think I've ever told an athlete to like pull up the pedals. I'm not sure if you do, but I doubt it.
I have not. No.
Yeah. The evidence for me is just not there. And like, yeah, I think in terms of actually kind of saving X, for the run, or saving the cardiovascular system for the run by using a low cadence on the bike, those kind of things. Like, I think you need to understand the consequences of that too. Like, again, this will be heavily dependent on output. So, the torque at 70 RPM and 300 watts is going to be pretty different than 70 RPM and 180 watts. And I think you see that across racing too, like that, you're probably not going to see someone like Magnus Ditlev riding at 65, 70 RPM for a race because the output is just way too high to do that. So, if he did that, there's no way he's going to run a good marathon. Like, his legs will just be absolutely destroyed. So, yeah, again, I think it's an individual thing. But in terms of kind of necessarily saving something, I'm not sure I totally agree on that front so much. But in terms of considering the range of cadence from a training and developing and racing aspect, that's something I'm pretty heavy on, I guess, from my perspective when it comes to cycling specifically, is really trying to just equip athletes with the ability to produce power over a nice range of cadence as well. And it probably comes back to that other question we had around, hills versus flats. But, there are times when being able to produce, your desired power output at 90 to 100 RPM or something like that is valuable because it's a false flat or slightly downhill or you have a tailwind. But then also being able to kind of, use a lower cadence at times as well, whether it's for, desired, training stimulus or session, or whether it's in a race, you're just going to have to be able to get up some hills at a lower cadence and produce that higher torque.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that the advice for that example of using a lower cadence to say the cardiovascular system and other similar things that you might hear, I think that it's probably a case of these things can work for some people and but not necessarily for everybody. So my first comment would be that, I would encourage anybody to try in training whether that's something that could work for you, and then find out whether it does or not. But there are reasons that if we stick to that particular example, for example, I see that very tall athletes tend to choose a lower cadence. That's quite natural, I think, because they have longer levers to push with, and also I think there's some evidence that the economy of a higher cadence when you have longer limbs, I think I've seen this, or maybe I'm making this up, so don't quote me on it, but it might be slightly reduced if you have a higher cadence just because you have more intramuscular movement, essentially. I remember looking this up at some point, but regardless of what the reason is, it seems like taller athletes, especially taller limbs, taller legs on the bike, self-optimize towards a lower cadence. So maybe they, because they have that longer lever, the relative torque is not as hurtful for them compared to somebody with shorter legs, and that might destroy their legs for the marathon if they try to ride at a very low cadence. So I think it's a range. You can have a range of outcomes depending on your profile and in different aspects. But that's one thing to consider, that this advice probably works really well for some people, but there's no single piece of advice necessarily that works super well for everybody, or at least not in terms of saving one system for another system. And it might also depend a bit on your just physiological profile and whether you are somebody that is able to sustain a higher heart rate for a longer period of time, or whether that's not really your kind of profile. So I think that's my most important thing really on this question, that certain things can work for some people, but it really depends on the profile of the athlete, not just physiologically, but anatomy can play a role, and other things, biomechanics, etc. And trying these things in training and seeing if it works, because it might work really well and it might be great advice for you, but it's not a guarantee. There's not one single piece of advice that covers everybody.
Yeah, I think that's where, I totally agree on that inter-individual differences, and then kind of finding what works for you. And relatively, yes, that might be a lower or higher cadence. But in terms of just intra-individual, like I probably would stray away from going to, say, a cadence that feels deliberately, too low, say in an Ironman, in order to kind of save yourself for the run.
Yeah, totally. No, I've never given the advice to ride at a low cadence. It's just that the self-selected cadence is lower in some individuals than in others. But I do think that the self-selected cadence, this is what we train for, right? Most athletes that do an Ironman, they have done long bike rides with a brick run off of the ride. And if you do that and you completely fail on the run, then you try to analyze why things went wrong, and potentially it is because you had just a way too low cadence and your legs were smashed, and then we can adjust for that in the next training session or in the race. But in general, if things work well in training with your self-selected cadence on the bike and the run, then I think that's usually a good, just a good thing to stick to, the self-selected cadence. And I don't know if there are, we already mentioned that we've never encouraged anybody to scrape the pedals or use the hamstrings. But are there any other pieces of advice that you've heard in terms of saving one muscle group or one component of physiology for another from bike to run? Anything that we could tackle in the same vein as these two?
Not particularly. One I'd probably touch on, and it's a little left field, and I'm sure you'll agree, is the idea of targeting a 50-50 left-right balance.
All right.
That's probably one where I see athletes hyper-focusing on that. And, there's some inherent limitations. Like if you're using a spider-based power meter, it's not really a left-right power balance. Versus pedals, which probably are, like a true left-right. But then again, also understanding that some asymmetry is kind of normal. Like we're not expected to be symmetrical beings all the time.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess one thing is with regard to bike fit, that's something that maybe, like, is that something that you have used for yourself or for athletes as a tool to protect certain muscles for the run? Let's say the hamstrings, for example, having a bike fit more focused on a quad dominant cycling style.
Probably for me, it's more around crank length. Like even personally, I ride 165s on my road bike and TT bike. And even now, I ride a 58 centimeter road bike. I could probably get on a 56, but having 165 cranks and 20 mils extra head tube is, for me, like a game changer in terms of my back and keeping my hip angle open. And it was big on the TT bike as well. Like often saw athletes go to a shorter crank and then drop the front end. But for me, it was like shorter cranks, increase the saddle height, and then increase the front end or the pad stack by the same amount. And so all of a sudden, it's pretty much the same position, but your hip angle is a hell of a lot more open. So that's probably something I played with a bit. And I think by going to those shorter cranks, naturally, cadence just came up a little bit with doing that. But again, like it's not a deliberate thing. I think you just then self-optimize around it.
Yeah, no, I have a similar experience. I'm on 160s on the TT bike. 165 on the road, just because it's harder to source 160s, but I've been really happy. I went to 165 on the TT bike, and then later on I went to 160, and each time I've gone down, I've experienced a a positive change in my cycling and how it feels. So definitely also a fan. But yeah, I think that's it for this question, and that's it for this episode. We've covered all the questions that we wanted to today. So thank you so much, Lucky. And one more question, by the way, because we are approaching the Olympic Games, and I wanted to ask you the rapid fire questions that I've been asking throughout most of this year to some guests on the show. Can you pick your podium for the Olympic triathlon races for the men and the women?
Yep, I'll go for the men first, Alex G, Hayden Wild, and then I'll go into bat for Australia with Matt Hauser for third. And then the women's, I think, I'm really torn on this one because I'm not sure how it's going to play out. I feel like perhaps my picks here will be wrong because we'll see a breakaway of 8 to 10 athletes really drive the swim bike, but I'm going to go Bogrand, Beth Potter, and then Taylor Knibb. For my 1, 2, 3 there. My idea behind that is that there will be a breakaway, but those two will run through and Taylor will hold on for third. And then mixed team relay, I'll go France, GB, and then jump in on our partners over here and go for New Zealand for third.
Solid picks. It's exciting times. It's coming up soon. Well, thank you so much, Lucky. It was great to have a chat, and looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, cheers, mate. Bye.
I hope that you enjoyed that Q&A episode. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with links that were mentioned. Of course, I'll also link to Lucky's coaching profile if you want to check him out as a coach. There was one study comparing the power output on flat versus uphill gradient that I will put in the show notes as a link. And I do recall that I mentioned another link that I would put in the show notes, but at the moment of recording this, I don't know what that was, but we'll get that sorted when in the editing process of the episode. So whatever that unknown for now link was, if you hear me talk about putting in another link in the mid part of the episode, we should have it in the show notes in the end. So check it out if you're interested in that. Let me take just a moment here at the end of the episode to promote our coaching services, which is what we do to make a living. And I want to highlight 2 reasons why I think coaching can make such a difference for athletes of all levels. 2 reasons that maybe some people are not really aware of or not really thinking of. The first one is that for a lot of athletes, what holds them back is not necessarily the training itself. The training might already be very good or pretty good as it is, but it might be things around or outside of training. So lifestyle factors of various sorts. And when we're working with athletes, this is something that we discuss and investigate very thoroughly, whether you are actually being held back by things outside of the training itself. And if that is the case, then try to create solutions for that. These kinds of things are often very difficult to identify in one's own life because it's hard to be fully objective and to have reference points for things like stress and so on. So a coach with all of the experience of working with many athletes across a number of years can be of massive help there. And the second point is that we are living in an era of information overload. It is great to have access to information, always unlimited access to information, but it is very difficult to put things together. So information in itself is not enough. It's not sufficient. As an example, I recently received an email from an athlete who actually was already working with a triathlon coach, but that coach didn't provide strength training in the plan. So what the athlete tried to do was to put together their own plan based on 2 different podcast interviews that I've done on the topic before. However, the end result was that it didn't work out. They didn't feel like that was a successful experiment. So is that because the advice given in the interviews was bad? I would say probably not. Is it because maybe the advice wasn't suitable for this particular athlete? That is entirely possible because everything depends on the context. So it could be. But that being said, many guests on this interview try to give quite general advice and give caveats when it might not be applicable. So I'm also a little bit doubtful that it would be so unsuitable for this particular individual that would be the main reason that things didn't work out. What I think was going on is that he was trying to combine these 2 probably different strategies and maybe get the best of both worlds. But probably what happened is instead is that when mixed together, things didn't pan out so good. And this example illustrates that having access to more information is not always better. Maybe following the advice of just one of those interviews that the athlete listened to would have worked out perfectly fine. but following the advice of 2 ended up being not so good. And I'm saying all of this about information not being so useful, fully aware of the irony in this, because we are here recording episode 438 of That Triathlon Show. But what I'm trying to get at is that the problem is not having access to information, but it is the difficulty in understanding the scope in which information can be applied, how information can or cannot be combined with other information, how to keep things coherent within a training program, how to use addition by subtraction so basically understanding what not to do just as much as what to do, or actually even more so, I would say. Understanding what not to do is probably the thing to pay more attention to than what to do. So as a coach, a good coach does not have to have all of the latest knowledge and all of the latest information to be a great coach. But what they need is the ability to filter information, to understand context, and to provide a coherent plan and coherent advice that fits the context of the athlete. So basically, to sum up this, the value of the coach is in that ability to filter and to synthesize information into effective training, basically by ignoring 95% of all of the information and just using the right 5% of information for that particular athlete and context. So if you're interested in getting help by a professional coach, you can check out what we have to offer on scientifictriathlon.com/coaching to learn more. You can read about all of our coaches, and you can email me on michael@scientifictriathlon.com to learn more about this and set up a free discovery call. We are extremely dedicated to the craft of coaching, and we hope to help as many listeners as possible with whatever your goals may be, whether you're a beginner or a professional athlete. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. If you're looking for high quality, practical and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure to try Precision Fuel and Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to choose, so you can easily find your personal favorite. Don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 Swim Trainer is a great tool to have in your toolbox to improve your technique and power, to target specific aspects of your stroke, and to maintain consistency when you don't have time to get to the pool. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.